Greetings, my name is Odin from the Odin's Musings YouTube channel, and I'm here on behalf of Aura Crystals. Today I will be teaching you how to use the square stitch for your jewelry applications. The square stitch is kind of a more modified version of the ladder stitch. It's kind of got one extra step in there, and instead of going straight across, we're actually moving down. Some characteristics of the square stitch are how the beads lay flat and flush next to each other within the beadwork, and your thread as you're moving through sort of makes a square pattern as you progress through the stitch. This can be used to make wide bands and cuffs for bracelets or other jewelry pieces, even rings. You can also find square stitch charts and even perler bead charts to create your own jewelry pieces, such as pendants or charms. So today we're going to be using two contrasting colors of seed beads. I've chosen to use size 11 Delicas. You can use whatever seed bead shape you would like. I just find that the Delicas, since they're very nicely uniformly cut, I like the effect of the finished product. You will also need a stop bead or a spring stopper. And I'm using a D-weight white Nymo, as well as a size 12 beading needle. You can use size 10 if you feel more comfortable with that as well. You'll find a detailed materials list, as well as where you can purchase, down in the description box below. And so, let us get started. I'm going to start by attaching my stop bead. All I'm going to do is thread it through, leaving about a 6-inch tail so that I can work in the ends. Then I'm going to pass through the bead once more, so that I trap it in there. And I've got one pass of my thread around the bead. If you're using a spring stopper, all you have to do is open it up, slide it through one of the gaps, and close it. I'm going to start off by threading an alternating pattern of beads until I have the length that I want. For this example, I have chosen 7 beads, an alternating pattern. I'm going to pass that down to my stop bead, and that is what we have for our first row. So then we're going to work to our left in order to attach our next row. I need to start with the blue color since I want the same color right on top. So I've added one blue bead. Now, I'm going to pass through the blue bead in the opposite direction so that when I pull, my thread forms a loop right on top of that bead. And when I pull tight, my second bead is right on top of the first row bead. If we kept moving in this direction and anchored on more beads on top of this one, that's kind of where the ladder stitch would be. But instead of that direction, we're going to move downwards and progress through these beads. So in order to add my second stitch, I'm going to pass through this bead. This is the bead that I just added. Then I'm going to add on one yellow bead, pass back up through the next yellow bead from the first row, pull tight so that the next yellow bead that I've just added sits in place. I'm going to set it for my next stitch just by passing back through the yellow bead that I've just added. And that's where my threads are, and I'm ready to attach my next stitch. So I'm going to add one blue bead, move up through the next blue bead from the first row, pull tight to anchor that bead in place, and then finish the stitch by passing through the bead I just added. And my third stitch sits nicely in place. Once more, attach a yellow bead, go up through the next yellow bead, pull tight to anchor it, and set up for the next stitch by going back through the bead I just added. Add a blue, go up through the next blue, then go down to set up for the next stitch. Add one yellow, go through the next yellow, and pass down through the yellow you've just added. Add on one blue, pass through the final blue, then go through the final bead you've added. And you'll have made your second row. To do the third one, you don't have to do anything fancy in order to turn your thread. We can work right here and move to the left to attach our third row. So I'm going to continue like I was. I'm going to add one blue bead. I'm going to pass backwards through the last blue bead on our second row. Pull tight so that our third bead sits right on top, And then finally, to set up for the next stitch, I'm going to pass through the last bead we just added. I'm going to add a yellow, pass backward through the next yellow on the row, just the yellow bead, I'm not going through anything else, then pass through the yellow bead we just added. Add one blue, pass back through the next blue, then set up for the stitch by going through the blue we've just added. One yellow, go through the next yellow, then pass through the yellow we've just added. One blue, go back through the blue, then pass through the final blue. So you'll notice we're just forming a loop with the thread in order to make a square between the two beads. So I've got this one. I'm going to go back through and finally back to where we start. Add on my last blue bead, go through the last blue on the second row, pull tight and situate our bead, and finally go through the last blue that we've added. Now we're ready to add on our fourth stitch, and it's going to be the same exact thing. We're just moving from left to right. So to start off, I add on my blue bead, go back through the bead. What we're basically doing is just going the same direction as the thread, so we want to form that loop around. So I do that. We have our fourth row started. I'm going to pass back through that blue bead again to set up for our next stitch. Then add on a yellow, pass back through the next yellow, and set up for the next stitch by passing through the bead we just added. You'll continue that until you reach the other end, then you can build on your next row, and so forth in a basic zigzag pattern. Now, like many of these stitches, it gets a little hard to start with and a little hard to handle until you get a few rows in, but after you get quite a few done, the pattern is very repetitive and you should be able to get a handle on it real quick. Continue building on rows, and then I will show you how to end threads and attach new ones. So once you are ready to end your thread, you'll want to finish a complete row before cutting off your threads and preparing to add a new one. You also might want to manipulate the beads a little bit, because this is a very loose stitch, and you can often end up with it off-kilter and being a little bit of a diagonal right there. But if you kind of massage it a little bit, it will straighten up pretty easily. Now, ending a thread on this stitch doesn't require any knots either. So I'm coming out from the top most bead. I'm just going to pass through the entire row down below. So now I'm on the opposite side. Then I'm going to pass through the top row again, then down one row. This by itself is good enough to secure the thread, but if you want a little bit more security, feel free to go back and forth downwards a few rows. But once you're done with that, you are ready to trim your thread. You can also remove your stop bead and secure your tail as well. To add on a new thread, I'm going to start from the fourth row down, and I'm just going to pass through every single bead in this band. I'm going to leave about an inch tail so that I have something to hold on to in case I accidentally pull too tight. Then I'm just going to go up the third row, go through the second row, and finally the top row, and that's just where I've started. Now, if I pull my threads, this is really secure, and this is really secure. So go ahead and trim that end, and from here, I'm ready to work on my next row. So I've added on one bead. I'm going to pass back through the lower bead and set up my stitch and continue forward, and that's how you end your threads and continue others. You can also do this stitch with multiple beads at the same time, kind of like to form this pattern, although in this example I did do single stitches, because it's much more tight and secure, but you can feel free to do this with 2 beads, 3, or even 4 beads or more. So I've started my thread by adding 2 of each color of bead that I wanted in the row. So now that I want to start off my second row, I'm going to add 2 more blue beads. I'm going to then travel around and pass back through the last 2 beads. When I pull tight, I will basically have a ladder stitch made of 2 beads instead of 1. To set up for my next stitch, I'm going to pass through the 2 beads that I've just added in order to make this stitch. Then I'm going to add my 2 yellow beads and pass back through the next 2 yellow beads that we've started on our initial row. Pull that tight so that we end up with 8 beads. Then I'm going to pass through the top 2 beads that we've just added. Add on our next 2 beads. Pass through the next 2 beads on our lower row. Then pass back through the beads we've just added. Add on 2 beads. Pass through the next 2 beads. Then pass through the next 2 beads that we've just added. Add our final 2 beads for this last row, go back through the last loose beads in this row, and set up for our next row by passing through the last 2 beads in the second row. And this is what our first 2 rows look like. Now once again, starting off these stitches takes a little bit of coordination once you're trying to work with all the loose beads, but once you build up higher, it should get so much easier. Now we set up our third row the same exact way as if we were doing it with a single bead, except using 2 beads. So, and since I want to use this pattern, I'm going to switch my colors. So, I've added on 2 of my yellow beads. I'm going to pass through the last 2 blue beads on this row. I'm going to set up for my next stitch by passing through the 2 yellow beads. Add on 2 blue beads. Pass through the 2 yellow beads on the lower row. Then pass through the 2 beads that we just added. Add on 2 yellow. Pass through the 2 blue. Then pass through the 2 yellow that we've just added. Add on 2 blue beads. Pass through the 2 yellows on the bottom. Pass back through the 2 beads that we've just added. Add on our last 2 beads. Pass through the last 2 beads on our bottom row. Then pass through the beads that we've just added. And from there, you're ready to build on your next row. The next row, row number 4, you're going to match the 2 colors that you have already established here so that you form these kind of squares going this way. Then when you go back up, you're going to switch colors so that we start with the same pattern as the first 2 rows. And you'll keep going like that until you've made the piece as long as you want. So laying these 2 side by side, you can kind of compare the pattern and where we switch. So I've started to switch here, a switch here, a switch here, switch here, and so forth. And that will do it for the basics of the square stitch. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much for joining me here. Once again, you will find a full detailed supply list as well as links to where you can purchase down in the description box below. Feel free to subscribe to Aura Crystals if you'd like to get updates on new tutorials and new techniques on jewelry making. And if you'd like to see more of my work, feel free to check me out over at Odin's Musings right here on YouTube or at odinsbeadhall.com.